We finally made it to the end, which we saw from at the very beginning is not just tacked on. That there's an organic relationship to what is presented at the end and connected to themes that run throughout. It would make sense, wouldn't it? If John Paul II writes in a spiral, that what he says at the end, he can only say because of everything that he said before. So the key word I would say for this panel is marital chastity. So what's the key word for panel 1?
Union.
Union. Panel 2A? Lust or concupiscence. Panel 2B?
Purity of heart.
Purity. Good. Panel 3A? Perfection. Panel 3B? I'll take eschatological sign. That's fine. Panel 4A? Well, actually, we didn't make a distinction. So panel 4A and B? Sacramentality of marriage or redemptive sign. Okay, and so now the last panel is marital chastity. So in this, John Paul II wants to accomplish at least 5 things in this panel. He wants to take this vision, remember, he calls it an adequate anthropology. We're calling it a robust Trinitarian anthropology. And he wants to take that anthropology and apply it to marital and family morality. He wants to look again at the significance of marital union. In other words, the sign value of marriage and marital union. He wants to look at the Church's reasoning behind Humanae Vitae. He wants to show that the moral norm of Humanae Vitae is not imposed from the outside, but it's a result of living what he calls the liturgical language of the body. It's the result of our very humanity. And he wants to reflect on the fruits of periodic abstinence. Wow, it's a lot that he wants to tackle. So how many of you have actually read the text of Humanae Vitae? Okay, do you know you're unusual? You are exceptional. Most people have never read the text of Humanae Vitae. How many people do you know have an opinion about Humanae Vitae? What it teaches, right? Most people have an opinion about it, and yet they've never read it. So I want to really encourage you, if you've never read it, read it. I think you will find, after taking this workshop, it's a cinch, thank you. You know, that it will make a whole lot of sense to you. Because we've addressed many of the issues and kind of the background terms behind it. Before I started reading Theology of the Body and getting involved, Humanae Vitae was very academic and dry to me. But really, Theology of the Body changed all that for me. So before we jump into John Paul II's reflections, I would just like to do a brief review of the 20th century history of contraceptive beliefs. I think it's really important. Most people are not aware that for over 1900 years, all, and I underscore all Christian traditions believed that artificially interfering with conception was a grave sin. Unanimous Christian teaching. So birth control was unanimously rejected as a grave sin. All that changed in 1930 with something called the Lambeth Conference, which was a conference by the Church of England, the Anglican Church, that declared in 1930 that birth control was acceptable only within marriage and only for grave reasons. I mean, I think it's important. We've got to at least give them that they were trying to minimize it, say only in the proper context and only for serious reasons. Unfortunately, that became the watershed event that resulted in all mainline Christian churches changing their doctrine except the Catholic Church. Please note that I made an important qualification. I said all mainline Christian churches. It's incorrect to say that all Christian churches have changed, because there are still some Christian churches who believe, as the Church, Catholic Church does, that that using contraception with full knowledge and consent is a mortal sin. So for instance, the Amish and the Mennonites, as official church teaching, do not embrace birth control. So please be careful in your language. But all mainline Christian churches have officially changed their teaching. In response to the Lambeth Conference, Pope Pius XI wrote Casti Connubii. The English title is On Christian Marriage in 1930, so he actually released it December 31st, 1930. Got it in under the wire there because he wanted to respond to the Lambeth Conference. And in it, he articulated the long-standing teaching of the church. I had to reread it again for my sexual ethics class. Again, I was so struck by it. It's beautiful. You can find it on the internet. I really recommend, though, that you get those little books so that you can mark them up. I take them with me everywhere, literally, everywhere. You know, for most women, they can stick in your purse. And it's good, rather than having these sheets of paper, I encourage you buy, you know, the little publications. So from Casti Connubii, 2 quotes. Since, therefore, the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who in exercising it deliberately frustrate its natural power and purpose sin against nature and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. Pretty strong language, isn't it? Although I think it's important to remind ourselves, vicious there means it's the opposite of virtue, meaning it's an act that is full of vice, an act that's opposite of virtue. 2 paragraphs later, he continues, our mouth proclaims anew. So when a pope is writing ex cathedra, meaning from the Church of Peter, and he's making a pronouncement that is official church teaching, he speaks in the plural. So that's a clue that he is speaking from the chair of Peter when he is using the plural. Our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony, meaning marital union, exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. Is it clear? Very clear. Any act of contraception or sterilization is a grave sin. So that was in 1930. Then came the development of the progesterone pill, what we normally just called the pill, in the 1950s and 60s, and it appeared more natural because it didn't directly interfere with the actual act of marital union. I mean, it's obvious how a condom interferes with the act of conception, but it wasn't so obvious if the birth control pill was contraceptive in the traditional way of understanding contraception. So we needed to develop doctrine. So Vatican II met during this time, 1962 to 1965 is when Vatican II met. And rather than tackle the specific issue of the pill, Vatican II in Gaudium et Spes, I have 50 to 51, but 48 to 51, there's this beautiful section on marital conjugal love, set forth again the clear and constant teaching of the Church on harmonizing spousal love with the transmission of new life. I think that's really important. This is what we're talking about, is harmonizing conjugal love and transmission of new life. So that was in 62 to 65. And then Paul VI further developed the teaching of Vatican II, so Gaudium et Spes 48 to 52, through his encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968. So you can see the development. 1930, 1962 to 65, so 1965, and then 1968. So let's look at a quote from Gaudium et Spes 51. So here's how John Paul II quotes it. The council text reads as follows. This is in audience 121. When there's a question of harmonizing conjugal love with the responsible transmission of life, the moral aspects of any procedure do not depend solely on sincere intentions or on evaluation of motives, but must be determined by objective standards. These, based on the nature, actually I want to just stop there for a moment. We'll come back to the second half. So the council is giving us a basic morality lesson. Listen to what it's saying. The moral aspect of any procedure do not depend solely on sincere intentions or on the evaluation of motives. In other words, it's reminding us that morality of an act is not determined solely by sincere intentions. I can be very sincere in robbing a bank. I need to provide for my family. Does that make my actions correct? It doesn't. I can be very sincere in taking the pill, but that doesn't make my action morally right. The church is reminding us that some actions have a moral rightness and wrongness built right into the structure of the act. Killing the innocent is always wrong, always. Rape is always wrong, always. Pornography is always wrong, always. It doesn't matter what your intentions or motives are. The very structure of the act is disordered. It's unnatural. However, in our culture today, these objective standards have been brushed aside because relativism is king. Here's my little visual aid to describe moral relativism. What does this pillow say? It's all about me. This is what moral relativism says. Everything is relative to me. If something is good, if I like something, if something benefits me, then it's good. It's morally right. If something doesn't benefit me, well, then forget about it. But I am the moral reference. Remember what Satan said? You will be like God's, knowing good and evil. We could translate into, you will be like God's, determining good and evil. This is what the human person wants to try to do, and, you know, hasn't changed very much in thousands and thousands of years of human history. Our church, though, has always taught, yes?
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
In regards to some teens, because I do a lot of teen work.
Yes, please.
I know a lot of the girls are saying, hey, I'm thinking about taking birth control because it helps with
yeah. Acne, menstrual cramps, yeah. Whatever, right.
What do you say about that?
A friend of mine likes to say the pill is bad medicine. What I would recommend is do your research on how the pill affects a woman's body. Frightening. Frightening. No one who loves a woman or a girl, a teenage daughter, a friend, should ever have her go on birth control pill. Part of the problem is the pill is not good medicine because it doesn't address the problem. It simply masks the problem. And someday they're going to go off it. And guess what? We're back often to the same problem. This is what often happens for women who take the pill to regulate their cycle. Well then, but it doesn't regulate it. It doesn't get to the root problem. The great thing, again, God bless Catholics. There is a doctor, Dr. Hilgers, at Creighton University, who for years has been working on trying to understand a woman's hormonal system and therefore provide alternatives to in vitro fertilization and things like using the pill to correct feminine problems. And it is something called NAPRO technology. We all need to know about this. And we are so blessed. Whoops, let's see. It's not hyphenated. It's just a big P, right? It's one word.
No, lowercase.
It's all lowercase? Okay. NAPRO technology. And it's a way of having a woman chart very specifically some of her signs of her body, and then through those signs bring it to a NAPRO technology practitioner who then can look at them and see what those tell him or her about what's going on or not going on in the hormones in a person's body. So Dr. Clint Leonard, who is in Chandler, his office, he would be the one I would recommend to call. There are a couple other people now in Phoenix. It's really a blessing. What you can do, call the NFP office here at the diocese. Call Cindy Leonard and ask her who are the NAPRO technology practitioners. Get some of their business cards.
So the NAPRO shows what is going on in the hormone.
It's a way of being able to diagnose what is the underlying problem of which, you know, the irregular periods, or for instance, the intense cramping, is a symptom. So it's getting to the root of the symptom.
And I think it's called CathMed. They just advertised it on the Catholic radio station.
Okay, CathMed, okay.
CathMed, that will tell you the consequences of taking the pill.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so CathMed is probably a website.
I Googled CathMed.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think Cindy probably, the NFP office probably even has brochures, you know, that talks about what does the pill do to a woman's body. It's astronomical. I mean, and actually, tragically, we have, in recent years, there has been an increase in deaths of women using hormonal contraceptives. Tragic, but it should make an impression. This is not innocent. So thank you. It's really an important question. Yes, Robert.
And the World Health Organization is actually listed as a carcinogen.
It's listed. I think it's a class 2. Class 1. It's a class 1 carcinogen, which means a carcinogen is what causes cancer, right? We had to get the asbestos out of the public school buildings, and yet we're giving it to young girls to put into their bodies. So it really is a contradiction. So it is important that we educate. Thank you. Really, really important question. Yeah?
I was going to say, before you leave, if you want anything from the NFP office, I have some of that ready.
Yeah, thank you. No, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she works for the NFP office, so thank you.
Rose Campbell.
Yeah, I'll get some for you.
The NAPRO technology uses the Creighton method of natural family planning.
Correct.
However, symptothermal method and Billings can be, if you learn those methods, you can take those to Dr. Leonard and he can use those
Wonderful.
to
Wonderful.
incorporate the NAPRO technology.
Wonderful. So if you're using, there are different methods of fertility awareness. And so even if you're using one different than the Creighton method, which is what Dr. Hilders uses, that you can use the data that you collect from that, at least with Dr. Leonard. So this is really important because IVF, it's the next issue. It's huge. I mean, it's really huge. And here's one of the reasons why. If marriage becomes redefined as between any two people, then what's going to be the next logical step as to what those two people want? Babies, a family. And how are we going to be able to say, no, you can't have a family?
It's already here.
I know it's already here, but my point is that what's going to happen is it's going to enter mainstream medicine. And we're, in terms of health insurance, now being required to pay for in vitro fertilization for the fabrication of children for same-sex couples. So this is why it's going to become even more an issue than it is now. It's already an issue, but this is where the logical conclusion is going, which is why we need to find we need to be spreading the message of these other alternatives for people who struggle with infertility in order to help people to keep it in its right context. So just, you know, kind of a heads up. All right, but before we get there, thank you for your question. The church has always taught that the morality of an act is determined not only by our motives, but by the means as well. This is what I like to call morality multiplication. So what I want to look at in morality multiplication is means times the motive equals what is the moral state of an act. So let's say I have, whoops, sorry, you've already written that. Let's do motive times means, sorry. I have, and we're going to talk in terms of ones and zeros. I have a good motive. I love my boyfriend. Is that a 1 or a 0? That's 1. I have a bad means to expressing it. I sleep with him. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 0. What does that equal? It's a 0. I have a bad motive. I want to trap my boyfriend into marrying him. Is that a 1 or a 0? That's a 0. I have a good means. I make him delicious meals. Is that a 1 or a 0?
That's good.
That's good. That's a 1. Exactly. However, tragically, Robert, what does that equal?
0.
It's a 0. I have a bad motive. I want to trap my boyfriend into marrying me. What is that? A 0. I have a bad means. I sleep with him. What is that? A 0. What does that equal?
0.
A big fat 0. I have a good motive. I love my boyfriend. Is that a 1 or a 0?
1.
It's a 1. I have a good means. I make him delicious meals. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 1. And what do we finally end up with?
1.
A 1.
Good.
In all of these scenarios, which one is the moral act? It's only, notice, the last one. When I have a good means and a good motive. The difficulty is our culture particularly wants to make which one of these scenarios a moral act?
All of them.
Well, all of them, but particularly this one. To say, as long as I have a good motive, that the good motive trumps the means. It shouldn't matter what the means are. Shouldn't matter what the mean is. That it should still be a moral act. The problem is that you never just have an act that is only an intention. You always have a means. You always have a way of carrying it out. And again, there are some means that are inherently disordered. And so it cannot make a good act. This is the structure of morality that Vatican II is reminding us of that we need to recover. Okay, so however, again, Vatican II stops there. It doesn't go on to explain what are the illicit or the immoral methods of birth control. Explicitly, it doesn't go into them, nor does it develop fully the objective standards that make them wrong. So if we go back to that quote, the second half of it was, the moral aspect of any procedure do not depend solely on sincere intentions or an evaluation of motives, but must be determined by objective standards. These, meaning the objective standards, based on the nature of the human person and his acts, preserve the full sense of mutual self-giving and human procreation in the context of true love. Such a goal cannot be achieved unless the virtue of conjugal chastity is sincerely practiced. What a beautiful articulation of the objective standards. It says that God is a meanie and he wants to force you to do things you don't want to do. No, what are the objective standards based on? The nature of the human person. That means they are intrinsic to who we are. They are directed toward our perfection, not towards depriving us, but towards perfecting us. And notice what they're trying to preserve. Remember the bumpers to keep us out of the gutter? Church teaching is trying to preserve the full sense of mutual self-giving and human procreation in the context of true love. That's what the church is after. The church doesn't want to settle for partial love, subhuman love, user love. The church wants her children to be able to express the fullness of authentic, true love. This is why we needed Humanae Vitae, in order to expound on what methods of birth control are found blameworthy and why. So let's look directly at the text of Humanae Vitae, number 10. In the task of transmitting life, therefore, they are not free to proceed completely at will, as if they could determine in a wholly autonomous way, the honest path to follow. But they must conform their activity to the creative intention of God expressed in the very nature of marriage and of its acts and manifested by the constant teaching of the church. Paul VI is simply restating Gaudium, it says 51. In other words, that we can't make whatever choice we want and declare that it's right. Again, that we aren't free to proceed completely at will as if we could determine in a wholly autonomous way. All on our own, because it's all about me, or it's all about my small world, what's morally right. Let's go on to two key passages in Humanae Vitae, number 11 and 12. These are the two that are most often quoted. Calling human beings back to the observance of the norms of the natural law. And when it says natural law, it means the law that's in accord with our human nature, with the way God created us in Bos. Calling human beings back to the observance of the norms of the natural law as interpreted by her constant doctrine, the Church teaches, and here it is, that each and every marriage act must remain through itself open to the transmission of life. Each and every time a husband and wife enter into that beautiful act of love in which they become one flesh, that act must remain in and of itself open to the transmission of human life. And number 12, that teaching often set forth by the magisterium is founded upon the inseparable connection willed by God and unable to be broken by man on his own initiative between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. So that has become kind of the classic language of the Church to describe that the conjugal act has two dimensions, the procreative dimension and the unitive dimension. So here's the kernel of the Church's teaching on the responsible transmission of human life. It is not our right to interfere with the natural power and purpose of conjugal love, of the conjugal act, but it must remain ordained to what it was designed by God. The conjugal act has a telos. What's the telos, the end of the conjugal act? Children and union. Building up, John Paul II will call it the communion of persons. It's interesting. In Theology of the Body, I noticed when I was rereading through these audiences last spring that John Paul II doesn't use unitive and procreative. When he talks about Paul VI, he uses it, but John Paul II's expression is responsible fatherhood and motherhood and communion of persons. That's the way he likes to speak of these two dimensions. That the telos is responsible fatherhood and motherhood, the procreative dimension, and the communion of persons, the reciprocal total self-giving of husband and wife, the unitive dimension. So the Church has clearly taught that there are two dimensions. What are they? The next two blanks? The two meanings? The unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. Here's a very simple way that someone here in the diocese I heard say one time. What God has joined, man must not divide. What God has joined in the act of conjugal union, in the act of one flesh union, procreation, and the unitive dimension, man must not divide. It's not a prerogative. I heard...
The Catholic Church can never change their position on contraception.
Never.
So when they
Never.
go on the news and they talk about, oh, the church is going to allow contraception.
Never.
And I look at them, I'm like,
Never.
it's never going to happen. It can't happen.
It cannot
It
happen.
cannot happen.
And that's exactly the next point I was going to ask you. How many of you have ever had someone ask you, when is the church going to change her teaching? And what's the answer?
Never.
Never. Why? Because it's not her teaching. She considers herself as a steward, A, of God's design, and B, of what God has revealed. We cannot change the natural law. We cannot change, our culture is trying, we can't change human nature. So what we've done, because we can't change it, we've just gotten rid of it. We've just said it doesn't exist.
Oh no, they didn't get rid of it, they're denying it.
Exactly, thank you. They're denying it. You can't get rid of it because it's still there, right? So they're denying that it exists, that it even exists. Is this difficult to explain to people? Very. Why? Because of those things we looked at last night. Coming out of a completely different cultural worldview. Sometimes it's that, but you know, some people, again, we have to give people the benefit of the doubt. I mean, some people use contraception with very sincere intentions. I mean, you know, people who use contraception are not monsters.
They are?
No, they're not. And so we have to understand, again, right impulse, wrong solution. I mean, how many women, I know many women who've been told, if you have another baby, you'll die. I mean, it's like to have a death sentence hanging over your head. So of course, what are they thinking they're going to do? Contraception or sterilization. And most of the time it's because we're very poorly educated about natural family planning. Most people still think it's the same as rhythm method. Wow! And it is not. So, you know, this is why I said before, well, you want an apostolate in the church? Become an NFP teacher. Teach about fertility awareness. It's an amazing apostolate. And people need to hear it. I think it's a huge part of the new evangelization. So unfortunately, we've lost an understanding of a sacramental worldview. We've lost an understanding of the divine design, of the truth that spouses are called to live out every day. John Paul II says the sacramental sign they became at the altar. So John Paul II was emphasizing at the end of the last panel, that they're called to live out every day. What happened at the altar, they're called to live out every day. So let's go back to what happened at the altar. Since John Paul II says this is, what can we say? I mean, what happened at the altar, again, is the light that illuminates what marriage is in its nature. So just a minute, I have to bend down and get my visual aids. I'm back. So before a couple pronounce their wedding vows, they are asked to state their intentions before they enter into marriage. We call these the marital promises. So the priest or the deacon asks, have you come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage? Have you come here how? Freely. You're not coerced. This is why arranged marriage, in terms of a Catholic understanding, is not a marriage, because it must be entered into freely. So notice the handcuffs are open, very key. So have you come here freely? In other words, do you promise to give yourselves to each other freely? That's what freely equals freely in that first part. Will you love each other as husband and wife some of the days of your life? Oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Will you love each other as husband and wife all the days of your life, right? In other words, do you promise to be bonded to one another permanently? You're going to be super glued. Do you understand this is what marriage is? I think part of the problem is now we have young people who don't even know what marriage is. So, do you promise to give, will you love each other as husband and wife all the days of your life? In other words, do you promise to give yourself to each other faithfully? And finally, will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the teachings of the church, the faith of the church? In other words, do you promise to give yourselves to each other fruitfully? It's beautiful. Will you give yourselves? So they're asking. They want it to be no doubt that the couple understands what they're entering into. Will you give yourself to each other freely, faithfully, fruitfully? In other words, do you promise to give yourself to each other? Totally. I think every person needs to have a total box in their house right there next to the statue of Mary. I'm not being facetious. On your way home, stop and buy a total box and enshrine it in your home. Why? Because people are going to ask you, why do you have a total box? So I have one, exactly. I have one that sits in my living room, and actually now I just only have a bedroom where I live in Maryland, and it sits in my bedroom with a bow on it. And a couple weeks ago, someone said, Katrina, why do you have a total box in your room? I said, let me tell you. Because it tells us.
And she didn't know who you were. She hasn't sat down.
No, what's even better is when my son came to visit, he asked the same question. So I said, let me tell you, it's to remind us of the way God loves us, right? First of all, it's not that we have first loved God, but that he has loved us and given himself as a ransom for the many. So it's to remind us how God loves us totally, and then how we are to love one another. Yeah. So stop on your way home, get your total box, and enshrine it. He did, of course he did. You know, he's 26. So there is, you know, they have an enshrinement of the Sacred Heart. Have you, any of you, enthronement? I'm saying, I think we need, okay, this is blasphemous. Right? We need to create, right, an enshrinement of the total box. I'm just kidding, of course. All right? But I am serious about having it in your living room. Because among other things, if you have kids, grandkids, you want them to see it. You want it to be engraved in their minds. Okay, so, I'm sorry, what? No. So this is the sacramental sign that's made at the altar. We will love each other freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally, and only then do you pronounce your vows which say that. Let's read how John Paul II says the sacramental sign that was given at the altar is meant to be lived. Audience 118. In fact, as man and woman live in marriage until death, in some sense they continuously repropose the sign they themselves gave through the liturgy of the sacrament on the day of their wedding. I love that phrase, continuously repropose. In other words, the sacramental sign of giving myself to you totally doesn't stop and start. Right? It's not intermittent. It's not like a bad cell phone connection, right? You know, as you're driving along, can you hear me? Right? Can you hear, you know, drop the call, then you gotta, you know, call back, right? It cuts in and out. That's intermittent. That's not the way we're called to love each other in marriage. Intermittently. That, okay, today I'll love you freely, faithfully, but not fruitfully. Okay, tomorrow, you know what? I'll love you faithfully and fruitfully, but I'm not going to love you free. You see, it doesn't stop and start. Continuously repropose. Unbroken, John Paul II says. So in other words, it shouldn't say, now I love you freely, faithfully, fruitfully. Now I don't. Now I do. Now I don't. Now I do. It's one unbroken string. In other words, we should live every day what he calls the liturgical language of the body. What is the liturgical language of the body? What did Christ say? This is my body given up for you. Would you say that this is a total gift of self? Can't get any more total than this. And where is this re-offered to us? In time and history? Here. So this is the liturgical language of the body. I give myself to you. Totally. John Paul II is saying this liturgical language of the body is meant to be lived out by husband and wife every day, even in the bedroom. Many people think they go into the bedroom, shut the door, and leave God out. Impossible. Where does the Holy Spirit dwell? In you, in your body, as in a temple. That means precisely where most people least expect to encounter God, in the bedroom, in marital union, is precisely where we should encounter God. John Paul II talks about the act of marital union being a liturgical act. Whoa, you want to have some eyes roll? You want to make some people a little bit nervous? Try to introduce that into the conversation. That the act of one flesh union between husband and wife is an act of worship. How could that be? What is a liturgical act? What did we see? A liturgical act is catching all of creation up and doing what? Offering it back to the Father in worship and thanksgiving. Ideally, what could be happening between a husband and wife in the act of marital union? They are catching up all of themselves and offering all of themselves to each other and back to the Father. I don't know about you, but that sounds like liturgy to me. Do you see how rich God's design is in the flesh? And so often we think that we have to get away from the material in order to really be spiritual and encounter God. And instead, what is it? It's a transformation of the material into what God designed it to be from the beginning. So this is what John Paul II is talking about when he's talking about living the liturgical language of the body continuously, even in the bedroom. From Audience 118, precisely in this moment, meaning in conjugal union, so rich in meaning, it is also particularly important that the language of the body is reread in truth. So the language of the body, when the two become one flesh in total self-giving, reveals the meaning and value of marital union. So if we just look at the language of the body, what's happening in that beautiful act of love between a husband and wife, we see that the language of the body is that it unites husband and wife in the closest of intimacy together and makes them together capable of generating new life. So if we are just objective and look at the language of the body in the act of marital union, what does it say? Unitive and procreative. Is the church imposing her view? No, the church is just being realistic. The church is just looking with full vision, not this way, but with full vision at reality as it is. And saying, in that beautiful act, the very structure of the act is unitive and procreative. And this is what we must protect. So the moral norm of Humanae Vitae is not imposed from the outside by some old celibate man in Rome, but it's according to the very structure of the nature of marriage and who we are as embodied persons. This is the key. We are not angels. We are human persons. We have an embodied nature. And as an embodied person, how do I express, or we could say enact, the total gift of self? Through my body. And so what we see is that it's the very nature of marriage that for those of us who are embodied persons express our total self-giving through the body. So we can say that just as virginity fulfills the spousal meaning of the body, we saw that before, that a virgin gives him or herself totally to God and lives the spousal meaning of the body in that way, so too we see that in the act of marital union, husband and wife fulfill the spousal meaning of the body according to what is uniquely theirs as spouses by giving themselves totally to each other. And rereading the language of the body in truth means rereading the whole truth of who we are as human persons. And what did we see? We saw that we are human persons made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God. And that means that God in his very nature is one. Gosh, if I'm not mistaken, another word for that is unitive. And God in his very nature is also three. He's fruitful. Now notice I didn't say he's procreative. Please do not make the mistake of saying there's procreation in God. There is not. But we saw the gift of love between the Father and the Son, by its very nature, is a third person. It is fruitful. So we see that God in his very nature is both unitive and fruitful, and we are made in God's image and likeness, so that means it's our very nature as human persons to be both unitive and fruitful. The church is simply saying, this is what it means to be a human person. And we take this with us. We catch up everything that we are and bring it into the marital embrace. So what does contraception do? John Paul II says it speaks a lie with the body. I have to say, high schooler and young adults, this catches their attention. This idea that we can speak a lie with the body. It's not a sacramental act. Because what does contraception do? It reduces the act down to just the physical dimension and says there is no spiritual reality. But the truth is marital union is a sacramental act with a small s sacrament. It reveals something about the mystery of the human person and God, that we are unitive and fruitful. So a contraceptive act says, I hold something back. It doesn't tell the full truth of who we are as human persons. It doesn't say, I give myself to you freely, faithfully, and fruitfully. Instead, what does it do? It divides what God has united by separating the unitive from the procreative dimension of conjugal love. All right, you want to totally ruin your next Thanksgiving dinner? Try dropping this into your conversation. Did you know that John Paul II said the conjugal act, artificially deprived of its procreative capacity, ceases to be an act of love? Pass the potatoes, please. I wouldn't suggest it. It's really not Thanksgiving table conversation. However, here's what he says. In Audience 123, thus in such a case when the conjugal act deprived of its inner truth. What's the inner truth of the conjugal act? That it is a total gift of self. It's a spousal gift. A spousal gift means I give myself to you totally in the body. Again, you see how celibacy is a spousal gift. The celibate gives him or herself totally to Christ in the body. So he says that in such a case when the conjugal act is deprived of its inner truth, because it is artificially deprived of its procreative capacity, it also ceases to be an act of love. Do you know what I say to that? Ouch. It's a pretty strong statement. An intentionally sterilized act of intercourse, whether through contraception or sterilization, ceases to be an act of love. That's hard to swallow, isn't it? But why? Because it no longer reflects a Trinitarian God. It no longer reflects the total self-giving, fruitful love of the Trinity. It no longer reflects Christ's total and irrevocable gift of self to the church, to us, and in the Eucharist. And it no longer signifies, expresses the marital promises in which the spouses promise to give themselves to each other freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. Did you ever have any idea that marital union meant all of that? I mean, it's incredible. And what have we done? We have reduced it to sex. Sex means two bodies colliding in time and space. And it doesn't really matter anymore who those two bodies are or what time or space they collide in. It's tragic. I want to encourage you. So when, after I taught confirmation, I founded something called a Young Apologists Club, YAK, YAK, in which I took the same kids that I taught confirmation and I continued teaching them on church teaching. And when we got to the section on sexual morality, or any time we were talking, I did not allow them to use the word sex. They had to use the word marital union. Why? Because it changes the way you talk about the act. And it was fascinating to me to watch the way it changed. We just throw the word sex around. But if you require yourself to use marital union, it leads to interesting observations like, I wonder why they're having marital union outside of marriage. Or as my son liked to say, why are they having unmarital union? It leads us to really penetrate into the truth of the act. Because every time you say marital union, what does it tell you? Where it belongs. Where? Marriage. In marriage. So I want to encourage you, don't use the word sex unless you mean sex. The reductionistic act of two bodies colliding in time and space. Use marital union. Do you notice the variety of language? Do you notice I hadn't used sex up to this point? One flesh union, the beautiful act of love between a husband and wife, the marital embrace, conjugal union. I mean, there are all kinds of other ways of describing that act. So I want to really encourage you to change your vocabulary. So here's an image that I have found it helpful to use. So Armando, would you help me for a moment, please? Could you come up here? Sometimes, again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I've said more than 1,000 words. Okay, Armando, I'm in a really tight spot. I need to borrow $20,000. Can you lend me $20,000 and I promise I will pay you back in 6 months? The answer is yes.
Okay, sure.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, would you close your eyes just for a moment? Okay, wonderful. Armando, open your eyes. Great. Let's shake on it, right? Okay, I promise I will pay you back the $20,000 in 6 months.
Okay.
Do you have any idea what I'm doing with my other hand?
No.
Okay.
Crossing your fingers?
Exactly. Do you see, I am saying one thing, but my body language is saying something else. By the very fact of doing this, we understand this is a symbol, right? This is overriding this. This is the best image I know to describe a contracepted act of intercourse. It's saying one thing, I give myself to you totally, right? Shaking of the hand, but the reality is another. Because I am preventing the act from expressing what it fully is meant to express. Thank you very much. I'll expect the check in the mail. Okay, let's take a deep breath. Head for the goal line. Here we go. Who says living marital chastity is easy? It's difficult. Chastity is difficult. That's why it's a virtue. We can't do it on our own steam. So let's see what Paul VI said in Humanae Vitae. Number 20, the teaching of the church on the regulation of birth, which promulgates the divine law, will easily appear to many to be difficult or even impossible to observe. Have you heard that comment? The church's teaching is unreasonable. It's impossible. Paul VI acknowledged it can be difficult. And indeed, like all great beneficent realities, it demands serious engagement and much effort, individual, family, and social effort. More than that, it would be impossible to observe without the help of God, who upholds and strengthens the goodwill of men. That's why it's a virtue. We need grace. Yet to anyone who reflects well, it cannot but be clear that such efforts ennoble man and are beneficial to the human community. In order to honor God's design by never separating the unitive from the procreative dimension of marital union, that's going to require times of abstinence for most people. And this is what we call natural family planning or fertility awareness. And so if for a legitimate reason, there's a time in the marriage when it is necessary to postpone having children, then the church teaches that it is morally acceptable to abstain during the time of fertility in the woman, and therefore then have recourse, is the language the church uses, so have recourse to the infertile times. That is morally reasonable. Why? Because you're not doing anything to change the act. Whenever you enter into the act, it remains in its full integrity, open to the possibility of the transmission of new human life. So that means that sometimes it will require a time of abstinence, 7, 8, 9, 10 days. It's, it just depends on the woman's cycle. Do you think that it might be difficult to abstain from the marital embrace for 7, 8, 9, 10 days? Men, what do you think? Yeah. Well, exactly. Women, what do you think? Yeah, it can be. But we're not left on our own. Remember this wonderful panel we had here? Remember our left to right, right to left? We're not left on our own. We have the power of Christ living within us. We have the Holy Spirit living within us. We've been baptized. We have the fruits of redemption. We are living an ethos of redemption. The whole reason Jesus came was to send the Holy Spirit to live within us so we can live a life of holiness and chastity. Remember, marriage is meant to be spousal and redemptive. And our sexuality is very often where we will most acutely experience that work of redemption. I think particularly for men. So we often hear critical statements against the church's teaching, but let's see what the church says are the benefits of following God's design and order, the benefits of abstinence. But wouldn't that be a great conference, right? Benefits of abstinence, come one, come all. Benefits of abstinence in marriage. I think maybe 3 people might show up. But again, we've got to change to realize precisely, listen as I read these quotes, precisely through self-mastery, as we cultivate the virtue of chastity in marriage through abstinence, that cultivates virtue in our lives. Very important to see. It's a platform for cultivating virtue when we exercise periodic abstinence. Humanae Vitae 21, the honorable practice of regulating birth rate demands, first of all, that husband and wife acquire and possess solid convictions concerning the true values of life and of the family, and that they strive to acquire perfect self-mastery. Yet this discipline, which is proper to the purity of married couples, far from harming conjugal love, rather confers on it a higher human value. It demands continual effort, yet thanks to its beneficent influence, husband and wife fully develop their personalities, being enriched with spiritual values. Wow, that is chock full of benefits. Let's just list them. The fruits that are developed by practicing periodic continence, periodic abstinence, self-mastery, true values of life and family, not being pushed around by your impulses or instincts, fully developing your personality, being enriched with spiritual values. Like, who wouldn't want that? Is that easy? No, it's difficult. And yet, natural family planning, periodic continence, offers us the opportunity to develop those. Tragically, I think we can say contraception and sterilization justifies emotional and spiritual immaturity. I think we have a lot of immature men and women walking around because they can use contraception and they don't have to develop self-mastery. They don't have to develop these qualities and virtues that come with periodic abstinence. You don't have to learn other ways of expressing affection and intimacy. This is why it's so important to abstain before you get married. Because if you abstain from marital union before marriage, then abstinence is an expression of love. Think about how important it is to make that connection in our young people's minds. That abstinence is an expression of love. And if you take that into marriage, then you understand that when you abstain in marriage, it doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I'm rejecting you. It doesn't mean that you're no longer desirable. It can be an expression of love. And it also means that we continue to express our affection in other ways. I also think we can say, and this would be my own little contribution, is that abstinence then is a time when we are reminded, even as married couples, of the virginal value of the body. That it's a time in which we are reminded of heaven, that our ultimate destiny is perfect union with God in heaven. And guess what? Even in your marriage, then, you get to practice eschatological virginity. Do you see how we can change abstinence from being something like, I guess we have, to having a spiritual and human value? There's so much that the church wants to offer us. So if marital union is so great, if it's such a wonderful expression of the liturgical language of the body, if the unitive and procreative dimensions of the marital embrace can never be separated, does that mean a couple has to have as many children as possible and in as short as time as possible? Does it mean that every act of marital union has to be intentionally fruitful? The answer is no. Because we see right within a woman's body that God designed the feminine body with times of fertility and infertility. If God had wanted every act of marital union to be intentionally fruitful, he would have made women the same as men. Men are fertile all the time, 24/7, from the time they hit puberty, pretty much to the time they put you in the ground, as long as everything is functioning the way it should. It's not the way women are. A woman's body is different. We're made with, we cycle. We're made with times of fertility and infertility. And therefore we see right within God's design that not every act of marital union needs to be intentionally procreative. So this is what natural family planning helps us to do, is to identify in the woman's body through biological signs. Her body changes over the course of her cycle to be able to determine when she's fertile and when she's infertile, and therefore to be able to decide, all right, do we want to enter into the act of the marital union and invite God to possibly send us a child, or do we want to, for legitimate reasons, postpone having children and therefore abstain for right now from marital union, from the conjugal act? So let's go back again to Gaudium et Spes, to Vatican II, number 50, and read what it says about the responsible transmission of life. From Gaudium et Spes 50, in regard to the transmission of new life, married couples will fulfill their task with human and Christian responsibility and with docile reverence toward God. This means they will make decisions by common counsel and effort. So just in case, what are those things that need to be considered? Gaudium et Spes goes on to tell us that there are 5 things that they should take into account: their own welfare and that of their children already born, the material condition of their life, the spiritual condition of their life, their state in life, and the interests of the family group, society, and the church. Those are the things that need to be taken into consideration. Because there are some people who maintain that practicing natural family planning is immoral. Is that a truly Catholic position? No, the Church has pronounced very clearly that it is a legitimate, a moral means of being responsible as mothers and fathers. But notice it doesn't just mean anything goes. Can you use natural family planning in a contraceptive manner? Well, yes. And then guess what? Where are we on our morality multiplication? Which one of these? Yes, but which one? One? Yes, we're at the second one, right? Good. I'm sorry. No, wrong motive, but a good means. Notice this is not a moral act. Just because your means is good doesn't mean you can have whatever motive. So I think it's important to realize it must be both. I always like to say every couple in China needs to know natural family planning. Boy, talk about where the interests of the family group, society, and the church itself have to be taken into consideration. The one-child policy is alive and well. Although, have you heard that they are now changing it to a 2-child policy? Wonderful, we're moving in the right direction. However, 2 children is still only 2 children. So in there, and this is not an exaggeration. I mean, there are stories all the time of women whose children are forcibly aborted because they already have one child. And so there are absolutely situations where people need to practice natural family planning. I have friends, and they have 2 children, and they're both blind. And, you know, they just really felt, by common counsel and effort and prayer, that was all they could handle in order to raise their children in a responsible way. And so they had recourse to natural family planning. So this is why church teaching allows for fertility awareness, to space birth or postpone having children by having recourse to the infertile times in a woman's cycle if the transmission of new life would be a hardship for one of the reasons stated above. So let's look one last time at the fruits of conjugal chastity, just because they cannot be pronounced. We can't remind ourselves enough. This is from Humanae Vitae 21. Such discipline dispose upon family life fruits of serenity and peace and facilitates the solution of other problems. It favors attention to one's partner, helps the spouses to drive out selfishness, the enemy of true love, and deepens their sense of responsibility. By its means, parents acquire the capacity of having a deeper and more efficacious influence in the education of their offspring. Little children and youth grow up with a just appraisal of human values and in the serene and harmonious development of their spiritual and sensitive faculties. Again, packed, huh? I mean, I often, when I read that and I think about what would be the more common composition or what's going on in a family if a husband and wife are contracepting, or one or the other has been sterilized, and they're asking their teenage children to abstain, and the teenage child is basically looking at them saying, well, why should I have to abstain? Look, right? You can have sex whenever you want. And like, my question is, what's a parent going to respond to that? Whereas if you are practicing natural family planning, you have 2 full feet to stand on, and you look your teenage son or daughter or your young adult son and daughter in the eye, and you say, we are not asking of you anything that we do not ask of ourselves. Because your mother and I, your father and I, we also have to live chastity in our marriage. We also have to live times of abstinence. We also have to practice self-mastery. And so I think it gives a powerful testimony and witness to the parents as they are raising their children in chastity. One of the huge fruits of practicing natural family planning. Here we go, last quote. From Theology of the Body, John Paul II, audience 23. So we're going to spiral around one last time. Listen to how John Paul II catches up so much of what we've talked about. Man is precisely person. No, man is person precisely because he is master of himself and has dominion over himself. Indeed, inasmuch as he is master over himself, he can give himself to another. And it is this dimension, the dimension of the freedom of the gift. He comes back to it again. That becomes essential and decisive for the language of the body in which man and woman express themselves reciprocally in conjugal union. The ultimate gift is that husband and wife live out every day the sacramental sign that they became at the altar. The sacramental sign in which they said, I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully. I give myself to you totally. The sacramental sign in which through their marriage they are an image of how Christ loves the church. And how did Christ love the church? Totally, freely, faithfully, fruitfully, giving his whole body till there was nothing else, nothing more he could give. That they live every day continuously reproposing the liturgical language of the body, which says, this is my body given up for you. And if husbands and wife, if husband and wife live this, then that is when God is glorified in the body. He's visibly manifested in the body. And that is when we will understand that the body is not only biological, but theological. Because it is really true that God's design is that the body would reveal God in all times and in all places. In the bedroom, outside of the bedroom. Single, married, celibate, that we are all called to catch ourselves up and offer ourselves back up to the Father in worship. This is my prayer for every single one of you, that you would leave here transformed. That you would have had your own little, transfiguration experience of seeing God, that light of faith, what we want for the new evangelization, to illuminate every aspect of human experience, to illuminate who you are, made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God. So my one request is that the next time you lift your glass of red wine, you will think of me. But not only me, you will think of John Paul II. And not only John Paul II, you will think of a robust Trinitarian anthropology. And you will know what a privilege and a grace it is to be made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God. God bless you, and may we raise our glasses high to our God who loves us. Amen.